It's not that corrosive, but under pressure, it will become over time quite damaging to pipelines, metal, steel. And so you've got to use a heavy chromated casing and special line. You can't just use any pipeline for that. I think they've come to realize, because you will have these ruptures that occur. In Sartartia, Mississippi, a really big one occurred where you had this instantaneous amount of CO2 reach up to the 150,000 parts per million concentration, which is about 5%, concentration. Right now we're at 0.04% concentration in just the atmosphere, or about 420 parts per million. But when you have a rupture, and that occurred from just some heavy rains causing the earth to shift, and it stressed the line and it cracked. But that particular line now, that CO2 plume that came out of that line traveled well over a mile and a half. They had to, hospitalize some of these people, but some that were very close to it suffered, greatly. I mean, the first responders had some great issues with that. They had people that were foaming at the mouth. They were unconscious. They had approached these cars. The blinkers were on. The doors were open, and they looked dead. But they were able to revive them. The problem with these plumes is that when they travel, they stick to the ground, because it's unlike methane gas. Methane is lighter than air, where CO2 is much heavier than air, so it just stays on the ground in a heavy concentration.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us once again on The State of Freedom.
The State of Freedom is a listener-supported podcast. We're committed to pursuing the truth about policymaking, decisions, and situations in Louisiana and at the national level that stand to impact our freedoms.
Please become a monthly supporter of The State of Freedom at freedomstate.us as we continue to expand the voice of liberty across Louisiana and beyond.
Meet the world's first living, full-spectrum, certified organic CBDA hemp extract. Ness's hemp oil was extracted from seed to bottle without chemicals, solvents, or heavy metals, and it surpasses world-class standards for purity. This pure and powerful CBDA has been proven to reduce aches and pains, ease mental tension, and promote better sleep. To get yours today, visit the Shop Our Partners page at freedomstate.us. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the State of Freedom. It is Tuesday, August 26th. We're having technical difficulties this morning. Just bear with us, folks. It's Tuesday, August 26th, 10 a.m. Central Time. I'm Danielle. I'm joined by my good friend and co-host, Chris Alexander. We are coming to you live on Voice of the People, USA, TV and radio network, Rumble, X, YouTube, and Facebook. Wherever you're watching us, please give us a like, a thumbs up, and a share. It helps us gain visibility. It helps us with the algorithms. Comment in the chat. Let us know what you're feeling, what you're thinking. We love hearing your thoughts and perspectives, and we want your insights on where we should be going with this show as well. So please leave all of those kinds of comments in the chat. We would love to hear them. Well, joining us today to dig into the carbon capture sequestration racket is Brad LeBlanc. He's joining us by phone, and he is an oil and gas exploration and development geologist and geophysicist with 45 years of experience. So I think it's fair to say that he's in a good position to explain the science to us. Brad, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Don, so much for having me. I appreciate your efforts. Love the name of the show, State of Freedom. Freedom is not free. We all have to fight for it. And so just thank you for giving me an opportunity.
Oops, sorry. Sorry about all that. We have some interference going on over here. Well, Brad, before we get into the conversation today, let me read the scripture of the day because it'll help set the tone and maybe it'll make people forget about all the technical difficulties we've had so far. All right.
Or at least be more patient with them.
Well, that's true. That's a good point. Okay, today's scripture is 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, and it says, "As David's time to die drew near, he charged Solomon his son, saying, I'm going the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses, that you may succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn, so that the Lord may carry out his promise which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons are careful of their way to walk before me in truth, with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. And all of this chapter is David's deathbed instruction to Solomon about David's unfinished business. And throughout the chapter, he's telling Solomon to be wise in the way he approaches each of the matters that David lays out. And it's clear in his instruction that David did not neglect to teach Solomon the scriptures and the laws of the Lord, as well as the ways of the Lord. And we know that the Lord considered David a man after his own heart. And that's what David is calling on Solomon to be as well, to be careful how he lives, to walk in integrity before the Lord with all of his heart and soul. And that's what the Lord's asking of us today as well. His promise to David was that if his descendants were faithful to the Lord, he would never lack a man on the throne of Israel. His promise to us is, as we are faithful to love the Lord God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, our place is in his eternal kingdom. So my charge to all of us this morning is to remember that we are part of an eternal kingdom, and the Lord expects us to live our lives in a manner worthy of that calling and of that place.
Danielle, it's we all are part of an eternal kingdom, and we're part of a generational kingdom. And the great example that David sets here in his instructions to Solomon is that we all should be teaching the next generation about how to be faithful to the truth and faithful to the Constitution and faithful to this legacy of freedom that we've been given. And so it's a powerful example of handing down to the next generation the things that we have learned and the things that have helped us to remain free. As Reagan said, freedom isn't free, and as Brad said, it doesn't survive in the bloodstream. We have to teach it, and the next generation has to carry it on because we're not going to be here forever. So that's really what jumped out at me very powerfully.
Yeah.
With David and Solomon.
And what is the legacy we're leaving for our kids,
Exactly. Yeah. It's a very, very powerful scripture today. As you mentioned, Daniel, Brad LeBlanc, I had a chance to listen to Brad the other night. I was in Boyce at a restaurant called Tunks about a week or so ago. And Brad gave an extraordinarily good presentation on the science of carbon capture sequestration. And, we tend to focus on other issues, but he has a mastery of the science because of his background. And Brad, I just want to tell you how much we appreciate your taking the time to be with us for a little while to help educate our viewers and our listeners on carbon capture sequestration.
Well, Chris, it's a privilege every time I get to speak. I think it's important your listeners understand, we don't do what we do for any financial gain, because there is zero financial gain. This cost us something. We're fighting against people that have a seemingly unending or unlimited supply of finances to do what they do and promote, the whole carbon sequestration issue. And it's just a fearful thing. And in fact, I think that what you're talking about is teaching people like myself with my background just to look at this from a common sense point of view. That's going to be required because, I won't be here forever. And this issue is a long-term issue. They're wanting to do things to our nation and to Louisiana, that could be drastically, catastrophically harmful. And what I see coming down the line is just not good. And it's concerns that I have born out of the study that I've made of CO2 and the whole issue of it being a greenhouse gas and how it's affecting the climate. I've studied that issue just as a hobby, more or less, for the last 15 or 20 years. And so I did not know that it would bring me, I guess, to the point in time when the studies that I put myself through, in addition to oil and gas exploration, would lead to such an event like this, where it seemed to have sort of taken a life of its own, Chris.
Sure.
People are so interested in this topic because they are in fear, of what could happen to their land that they really love and they've cared for all these generations, possibly. We're here to help them as much as we
Yeah.
can.
Brad, when did you was there a single triggering event that finally said, look, I've got to step into the fray here? This is something that is just too alarming not to get involved in.
Yeah, Chris, like many people, we were too busy to really pay much attention to what others were doing with this issue. But we had some acreage that the company that I work for is a 140-year-old, private institution. And they've got quite a bit of acreage. And some of that was in Vernon Parish in the Masters Creek field, which is like a 70-mile long Austin chalk field that's been in production for decades now. And so we have some acreage that's inside of a producing oil and gas unit in the Austin Chalk. And we were approached by landmen to sign this participation agreement, if you will. Some people refer to it as sort of a lease agreement to go along with carbon injection into the well that was being used as a producing oil and gas well. And I thought, well, no, we don't want to do that. It's still producing. And then the landmen informed us that later, much later down the road of, multiple conversations that they had been trying to have with us, because we just weren't interested in doing it at the time. And they said, well, they can just take your land via the use of eminent domain under the 2000 Sequestration and Expropriation Act, expropriating your land under the vehicle of eminent domain. Well, that right there just struck a chord with me. Listen, I'm 69 years old now. My dad was at Guadalcanal in the Marines. His brother died at the Battle of the Bulge. I have a true, genuine affection for what they submitted their lives to. Dad lived to tell about it. His brother did not. And so, you want to protect what those men that went before us died for and maybe risked their lives for. And so I've always had an appreciation for those in the military and anyone that is working to protect our freedoms that we fought for in this country. That's my motivation, really, Chris.
Yeah. Did you, and I'm sure that you were familiar with eminent domain, even before this specter of carbon capture sequestration reared its ugly head. As you know, under the Fifth Amendment, the government, under certain limited circumstances, does have the authority to expropriate land for an established public use for just compensation. But that's not what this is about. At least it doesn't appear to me to be about that. This seems to be largely profit driven by private corporations. I'm sure that alarmed you when whoever told you, well, they could just take your land.
Absolutely. Eminent domain, we are all familiar with that. If they need to build out a road and take land that maybe a gas station is on the corner, another business is on the corner, they'll have to sacrifice, those positions, for the city to build out a new road. So they pay them a reasonable value, for their property when they widen the road, but never for something like this huge, amazing project that they want to institute by making first CO2 commodity that could be sold. And really, it's not so much that it's a commodity. Yes, if you want to sell carbon credits, like what Al Gore was talking about years ago when he was threatening that CO2 was an existential threat, to the world, which it's not. But the use of eminent domain for an unproven science like this, and it is unproven. Men, such as Stephen Koonin, New York University, he's a professor there that came out of his 2019 publication called Unsettled. That's available at Amazon. It says what climate science tells us, what it doesn't, and why it matters. Stephen Koonin, former Undersecretary for Science, U.S. Department of Energy. That's a 2019 publication. It's easy enough to read. You don't have to be a scientist to read it. I just think that, I've advertised that to different legislators just to get them on board with where we stand and how they should stand, because this is not a proven science. And you're trying to use something, a vehicle of eminent domain, to disrupt people's lives. And in the land of the free and the home of the brave, no one should lose their property rights for an unproven science. And that's what we're saying.
Amen. And Brad, when we hear in the kind of in the public domain about this carbon capture sequestration, at least for the last number of years under the Biden administration. And you mentioned Al Gore, they make carbon dioxide out to be some kind of poison gas that's going to kill us all. But really, the real danger is the way that they seem to be managing the sequestration, the burying of this carbon capture of the carbon dioxide that they are saying is so dangerous. What is it that they're doing to capture and sequester the carbon, and why is it dangerous to people's health and safety?
That's a great question, and that's the heart of it. First off, Richard Lindzen, PhD, atmospheric physicist from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, is one of the scientists I've been studying in that 15, 20-year period, along with William Happer, Princeton University. He's professor emeritus there. So these are men of older, or further along in life, and they don't mind speaking the truth, I think, about this seismic, because they've made their livelihoods in a university are not dependent upon grants, whereas a lot of these younger scientists are dependent upon getting $1 million or $2 million grants to keep their research alive. And you're a result of that study, whatever you're doing, better support climate change, or you're not going to get another grant. But just from Richard Lindzen, he said, and look, they put out studies just as recent as April of this year and June, which I'd be happy to forward you those. But he says it will be remembered as the greatest mass delusion in the history of the world that carbon dioxide, the life of plants, was considered for a time to be a deadly poison. It's just, when you read these reports, and they have won cases for Shell at The Hague, because Shell was being attacked by, I guess those that thought the fossil fuel industry was destroying the planet. But these men were the expert witnesses, those three in particular, William Happer, Richard Lindzen, and Stephen Kuhman. And together, their data that they presented before the judge was in court was shown to be correct, intact, and they were judged not guilty. Shell was judged not guilty at the testimony of these men. But let's see, you had another question too, I think, Danielle, that just the safety issue.
The safety of this sequestration, and how could it potentially negatively impact people's health?
Well, listen, this is a long term. They are planning pipelines in 5-10 years from now, running from the mid-states all the way down to Louisiana. But these pipelines are just not guaranteed to hold CO2 forever. They've had, along the Denbury line, which runs from northeast Louisiana to southwest Louisiana. That line, which Exxon purchased from Denbury, which carries CO2 in it, has already had like 13 safety breaks in 17 years of his life. And some of those, one was right there north of Sulphur, Louisiana, a little community called Beulah, where a compressor station, the pig trap seal, which was at the time a polyurethane seal, as I understand it, it got corroded. And that's what happens with CO2 in any pipeline, really. You get condensation to occur inside the line because of the temperature changes, that you have. Usually you'll have some condensate, and carbon dioxide, when it interacts with moisture, forms a carbonic acid, so it makes it more corrosive. It's not that corrosive, but under pressure it will become over time quite damaging to pipelines, metal, steel. And so you've got to use a heavy chromated casing and special line. You can't just use any pipeline for that, I think they've come to realize, because you will have these ruptures that occur. In Sartartia, Mississippi, a really big one occurred where you had this instantaneous amount of CO2 reach up to the 150,000 parts per million concentration, which is about 5%, concentration. Right now we're at 0.04%
Wow.
concentration in just the atmosphere, or about 420 parts per million. But when you have a rupture, and that occurred from just some heavy rains causing the earth to shift, and it stressed the line and it cracked. But that particular line now, that CO2 plume that came out of that line traveled well over a mile and a half. Why do I know that? Because it crossed the Yazoo River, and the Yazoo River was about a mile, to the west of where the pipeline ruptured. Well, people were being sick in the river. They had to, hospitalize some of these people, but some that were very close to it suffered, greatly. I mean, the first responders had some great issues with that. They had people that were foaming at the mouth. They were unconscious. They had approached these cars. The blinkers were on. The doors were open, and they looked dead. They looked dead, but they were able to revive them. The problem with these plumes is that when they travel, they stick to the ground because it's unlike methane gas. Methane is lighter than air, where CO2 is much heavier than air, so it just stays on the ground in a heavy concentration. And it's in a high concentration such that it won't even allow an automobile. If you try to drive through it, your automobile may just come to a stop because it needs air to run. It needs oxygen to run, provide a spark for your engine. And so that's how, when the first responders came, even their vehicles were starting to sputter. So you had to have, I guess, electrified vehicles in order to get in there and take these people out to safety. But some of these people definitely did suffer long-term consequences. And so as I got to know this issue, it was more than just leaving oil and gas behind in the ground, which is what the oil and gas industry, I think, faces. The safety issue jumped really up to the top because of the way they were going about it. So as I studied more and more about the manner in which the Conservation Commissioner is allowing, sequestration to occur by injecting it into the shallower sands, that right away stood out to me as a big, giant, safety issue, safety concern, because those sands, if you were sticking to zones, sand bodies that were known hydrocarbon traps, that would be okay, but they're not. They're trying to inject this into shallower zones where it will just rise on up to the surface until it may intersect one of these boreholes that is got damaged casing, or maybe it has a poor cement sheet around the casing, or maybe it just has no cement sheet, because that is in actuality what happens.
Yeah.
The CO2 could just easily come up to the surface, either via the cement sheet or via a fault that rises to the surface. Go ahead. You have a question?
Yeah, Brad. So what was the origin of this carbon capture or this carbon injection? Was there an industrial purpose that started it, and then because of the safety, they try and put this screen of carbon is terrible for everyone, we need to sequester it? Like, what's the chicken and the egg here? Or did the carbon fears precipitate them trying to find an industrial use for it?
Sure. Yeah. Long ago, I mean, this is maybe 30, 40 years, Denbury now has been using CO2 to help inject into known oil and gas, or just say oil reservoirs, to help lighten up the oil, help relieve, release some of the oil from the grains. And you'll actually get much more oil out of the ground by injecting CO2 into the zone. Well, Denbury had its own naturally occurring CO2 source up at Jackson Dome, Mississippi. In some places, you have that. You have CO2 as the primary reservoir gas, and so that it can be used for enhanced oil recovery. And in doing that, some of that CO2 is going to stay down there. I'm pretty sure that some of it will come back up with the oil that they'll have to capture, but a lot of it does stay in the ground. So, but a lot of oil has been recovered with the additional use of enhanced oil recovery, or just you'll hear it referred to as EOR. And so it's good that way. I mean, it's good, but the fact that they're doing that, it is starting to have issues, like in Texas as well as in Louisiana, where even though it's been used for enhanced oil recovery up in Louisiana, in Franklin and Madison parishes, that carbon dioxide gas did find some old boreholes that did not have enough cement around the casing, enough of a cement sheath around the casing, and it found its way back to the surface. And the sheriffs in those parishes, stated, look, this was a big deal. These men that had to go into this big giant recovery operation had to wear oxygen masks. And this took, as I understand, Denbury the better part of a year to correct. The same thing in Texas. In the Permian Basin out in West Texas, you have, CO2 being injected into zones, and that CO2 has found its way back to the surface, either through old degraded boreholes or through some fault or fracture that's allowed the gas to come to the surface. And so what you see, there's like a geyser. I want to say it's not in Pecos. There's one in Crane County. There's one in Pecos County. Two different instances. In Crane, it is like a geyser coming up out of the ground, and it rises about 100 or 200 feet up in the air. And nobody really wants to take blame for that particular incident. And the one in Pecos County has created a lake, like a 60-acre. That's a very toxic lake because CO2 has the bad habit of bringing up heavy metals with it. So when you look out onto what looks like sort of a barren land, you've got this big giant lake out there, but it will kill ducks, it will kill animals that come try to drink, out of that toxic waste. And nobody wants to take responsibility for it. And it's still just gushing, thousands of gallons per hour. And it's just something I pointed out in the meeting at the Two Pond Lodge tonight that, look how beautiful Lake Kincaid is. Well, imagining that kind of catastrophe happening to the beauty of Lake Kincaid and just destroying the beauty of that, destroying the habitat of Lake Kincaid. And so the way they're going about it, and I can tell you that injecting CO2 into shallower zones, it's going to find its way back to the surface in some negative way, and it's not going to be pretty.
Brad, are we talking about frequent accidents? I mean, what level of catastrophe are we talking about here? If they start doing this universally, they start doing this everywhere, these carbon capture wells and pipelines. What are we looking at as far as accidents and not just threats to human health? It sounds like this is a matter not of if, but of when.
No, it is, because when you look at the number of wells in Louisiana, you have over 400,000 wells, both active and inactive wells, that would all be subject to having degraded cement. Chris, when we drill a well, we put casing in it, and the whole plan is to put a cement sheath around it, but we're much more concerned about the hydrocarbon bearing zones. We'll squeeze additional cement above and below the hydrocarbon bearing zones to make sure that it just stays isolated. Then we perforate the zone and the oil and gas comes to the surface. But on our way down to the hydrocarbon bearing zone, we also set shallower casing, like generally somewhere between 2 and 3 or 4,000 feet, and we'll set a surface casing there. And we'll once again, pump cement down inside through the drilling string, open-ended without a drill bit, so that the cement can go around the casing. And if you go down again, you'll drill another 3 or 4,000 feet. You may set another string of casing and once again have the same process where you're trying to create a cement sheath around that casing. We also will later run a cement bond log to see how much of that cement is actually around the casing, because in the presence of any gas, whether it's derived from shale gas or from any other little gas bearing zone, it can create vulgular spaces behind the casing to where you don't have any cement. And so all we're really concerned about is at the bottom of the casing, which we refer to as the casing shoe. We just want to test that casing shoe and make sure it's going to hold the mud, the density of the mud, the weight of the mud that we're going to be using as we proceed down to the hydrocarbon bearing zone. And if they come back in and start injecting CO2 in it, they likely will be encountering wells, any of those 400,000 wells, which is like Louisiana becoming a pincushion, if you can imagine. It's likely to intersect some of those well bores and find its way back to the surface. How many? Anthony Ingraffia he's a New York engineer, did a TED talk here recently, which I included in my presentation. And after just 4 or 5 years, about 25% of those wells encounter, degraded cement. But after about 17 years, that number climbs up to about 58%. And it's much more prevalent in directional wells. So there's been a lot of horizontal drilling in Louisiana, and those directional wells likely don't have much cement. And they can try. To squeeze more cement, but over time, it's still going to become degraded, no matter what you do.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Brad,
Chris.
is something, one of the concerns that people have expressed about this is that it degrades the value of their land, the value of their property.
Hmm.
Is that true?
Gosh, one of the great ways to answer that question is to go up to Franklin, Madison County and see, how much that degraded their property. I would think that it would. I don't have any direct evidence of that. I think that that is naturally a concern. Certainly, if you had a beautiful home or camp around Lake Kincaid, yeah, and you had a catastrophe there, oh, it would drive your value to near nothing.
But the mere fact, but Brad, but the mere fact of these pipelines and these injection wells being on the property for carbon capture sequestration, I
Mhm.
would suspect that, the mere threat of accidents and explosions and that sort of thing would devalue the land. I mean, that seems like
I
a big
agree.
concern. Not only are they taking people's property, they're devaluing it.
Yeah, and Chris, that's why I think, the success of our meetings. I mean, every time we have a planned meeting, it's pretty much a packed house, Chris, because people are fearful of not only that, losing the value of their land, but just the safety of the drinking water. Some people have natural springs on their property. They invest into their property and they care for it over the years because they love it. They love nature, but this is a direct threat to it. When you understand it as I do, and I have testified a few times before the Louisiana Assessment Committee on this, but I think, like you stated in the very beginning, or as Danielle stated, when money gets involved, common sense leaves a man. He's only looking at the dollars and not after the potential catastrophe that could occur from it. So yes, the value, the safety is an issue, and
Yeah.
those are paramount. That's why people instinctively don't trust government. Now, may not know why, shouldn't trust government. We're out there giving them the reasons why what they're believing is correct. Rush Limbaugh made a similar statement in an interview with Barbara Walters years ago. What did you owe your success to? He said, well, listen, I am just well articulating what people are already thinking in their minds. I'm not actually persuading anyone. I'm just giving them the reasons that what they're thinking is correct. And so
So
I
true.
think that's
So
why
true.
people come out and listen to us. And because what we're presenting is facts, incidences that have occurred in the past, reasons that any CO2 or policymaker in the government should be concerned. There's so many of these reasons to look at. And you need to have, at the very least, an environmental impact study like they wanted to do for the XM pipeline for seemingly how long? And how long did that go by? They had environmental impact studies forever, it seemed like, to where it was just
Yeah.
eventually canceled.
It's funny how, Brad, they'll do environmental impact studies for highways and bridges, but they won't do an environmental impact study for something like this. It just seems really odd.
And let me tell you, geologists in Texas are very concerned. I think you probably heard me say, Chris, that after realizing in 2011 they've had a large number of increases of these well bores that were failing in Texas. And so the geologists went out there, and when they saw the big, 60-acre lake in Pecos County, and the geyser coming up to the surface. It doesn't even have a casing head on it. It's just rising out of the ground like a geyser. These geologists have said, look, I mean, this is insane. There's a high risk of crossflow, they said, and well control issues exist in the area, posing catastrophic risks to groundwater tables. That's the
Yeah.
geologist in the
Brad,
Permian
you
Basin.
mentioned something. Sorry to interrupt you, but you mentioned something. Actually, there was an exchange the other night, and one of the reps was talking about how he's continuing to study the issue to make a determination about it. And one of the people there responded, "We already have all the information that we have. I mean, the information that was just presented that night should be enough for you to be alarmed and to do so. What else do we really need to know about this?" And Brad, didn't you testified, I think, in front of these committees this past session on all of this,
Absolutely.
didn't you?
Yes, I started last year, Chris. I called Brett Gunman, when I realized that, that this was the 2009 CCS Sequestration and Expropriation Act. My only outlet then was to call the legislators in the area, which was Brett Guyman for the Lake Charles area. He happened to be the chairman of the assessment committee. He welcomed me into this roundtable discussion. That was last year. Then this year, there was, a couple of big, assessment committee meetings where probably had 100 or 200 people there, Chris. I'm not sure if you were at any of those. I think you were, weren't you?
I was at one of them.
You had one of them. Did you speak? I think you spoke as well, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I did speak at one. Yes.
Yeah.
But
And
I think
I was sitting right
ahead.
behind you when you spoke, and what you said was great, because we're trying to get these men and women to wake up and realize what we're saying. We didn't just dream this up. We're not speculating. These are the facts. You've got to appreciate
one of the
what is
things, Brad,
actually
one of the
happening.
things that makes me one of the very comforted is the fact that there are people with your level of scientific knowledge about this to back it all up. I mean, so it's always good to know not just you, but other geophysicists and geoscientists understand the threat of this and how important it is that we understand it. So when I'm testifying, I'm not qualified to testify, on a scientific technical basis. I'm certainly qualified to testify on, the absolute reprehensible act of eminent domain, taking people's property by private companies for economic gain for any reason. But it's always good to know that there are people like you who really know the science behind all of this.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate you saying this, Chris. When I testified the first time, Chuck Owen, told me that, he said, man, that you did great. He said, that was very profound. I said, Chuck, I said, really what I'm testifying to is known, very well known, commonly known. It's just common sense in the oil and gas industry amongst most any engineer that has any knowledge of what goes on at the well site. What I'm testifying to is strictly just common sense. And I'm so surprised that it hasn't been stated before me. We got involved, like I said, because of the eminent domain issue. And as we studied it, became more concerned over the safety issues. And then as I began to testify, I was so surprised that so much had happened prior to my being there and that it had not been stated yet. So now it's taken a life of its own. We hope the legislators are listening more closely now, and certainly the governor, because they're selling people down the river and it does not feel right at all to us.
I agree with that. And Brad, while I have your expertise on tap here, can you just explain for me, for my benefit? So there's carbon capture that's being industrially used to inject into wells to get more oil and gas out of. This is my layman's term. Okay. And then are they also just capturing carbon and burying it in the ground with no end point, or is that not a thing?
They had said, yes, they're sticking it in the ground without an endpoint, and that's another issue that I have with what needs to happen, because I want to demand transparency on their part. What we were told, proposed by Denbury, we received a letter, and they wanted to inject CO2 starting at in the 4,500 foot level down to about 13,000 plus. It was like an 8,540 foot thick vertical section where they wanted to inject CO2. We purchased seismic data to show that, look, there is no hydrocarbon or CO2 trap at any of those levels where you want to inject. You're going to inject into these massive sand bodies, and it's going to just keep rising on up, dip, in this case, to the northwest. And it's not going to stop until it finds some sort of a natural stopping or resting place. But it could easily intersect a borehole that has degraded cement or a fault and find its way back to the surface. And en route to finding its way back to the surface could intersect the Chico Aquifer, which was as shallow as 200 feet and as deep as 1,400 feet. So say 200 feet in central Louisiana, maybe 1,400 feet towards, southern Cameron Parish. But, anywhere along that where those two intersect, the Chico Aquifer with whatever injected CO2 is being created, whatever plume is being created, it's going to somehow find its way into those sensitive areas. And the Conservation Commission has a responsibility legally, a legal responsibility to protect those areas. So I want to see
Yeah.
transparency. If Exxon presents where they're going to inject this into, I want to have them prove to the public that there is definitely a stopping point, a known hydrocarbon bearing trap for that CO2. Don't just inject it into sands and think that it's going to somehow create its own seal. It won't. We know that from other studies that have been funded by the Department of Energy and put out by the researchers at the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They concluded that after CO2 is injected into the ground in a sequestration stage, less of the gas was converted into rock, or in other words, less of it was mineralized that had been previously thought. And it's, in fact, they say only a small fraction of the CO2 becomes rock. So I think that they and the legislative committee proceeded along a line initially that CO2 would become its own trap, but that's not what happens. CO2 doesn't become its own trap. And so it's just going to keep rising on up until it intersects some other, fault or borehole that's degraded. That's just common sense. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Anybody in the
makes
industry
sense.
understands that.
Chris, I don't want to step on you. I know we're having a little bit of a technical lag here with the bandwidth. I was going to go ahead and play a video from Governor Landry, unless you have a question that you wanted to get in.
No, I'm
Chris?
interested to hear Brad's response to this recent video.
Okay, yeah. So just to set it up, it looks like the governor has a very different view of carbon capture sequestration than the one that's being talked about here. So if Brad, if you don't mind, we'll take a look and a listen and we'll get you to respond to that.
Thank you.
So the question is, can we continue the momentum? And I would tell you that the answer to that is yes, but only if we're willing to embrace new opportunities. And one of those opportunities is carbon capture. And many legitimate questions about it have been raised, but many statements have been made that are simply not true. But the reality is do we embrace it or don't we? The question is, are we going to sell it, or is Texas done? Do we create a safe and trustworthy way to embrace this new opportunity, like those of us who stood before us and embraced oil and gas in the refining business 50, 60, 70 years ago? Do we keep this historic momentum going, or do we really give it up?
All right, Brad, over to you.
Yeah, well, he never did say what statements were being made that he disagreed with or weren't true, did he? And that, yeah, and also he's talking money over safety. You didn't hear him actually say anything about safety, did you? Listen, I think if you poll the people right now, they would be pretty disappointed in the governor. He has an opportunity to be a hero for the people and cancel this whole sequestration business, or he can be a zero, because that's what he's looking at. Yeah. If he keeps infuriating people with this whole eminent domain issue and not putting safety as the forefront of his thinking, I just don't know. I just don't think that the governor is I would love to have the opportunity to present this to him, if I could. Maybe he hasn't listened. Maybe he hasn't seen it. I don't know, but these are just the plain facts. Look, yeah. CO2, he probably thinks that CO2 really needs to be captured to save the planet. He probably has some element of that in his brain, but really, let's talk about that just for a moment. You're at 0.04% in the atmosphere. You've got nitrogen as the primary component, oxygen followed by argon, and then way down the line is CO2 at 0.04. But mankind's contribution to the planet is only anywhere from 3% to 10% of that 0.04. So even at 10% contribution, man's contribution, now we're talking about 0.004. You know what that's like? At .04 in a 10,000 seat auditorium of the Cajun Dome here in Lafayette, that would take up, CO2 would take up only 4 seats of the 10,000 seat auditorium. But when we're talking about mankind's contribution and whether or not we should capture it all, if it's only 10% of that .04, now we're talking about not even one complete seat in the 10,000 seat auditorium of the Cajun Dome.
What about the cow farts, Brad? Bill Gates is really worried about the cow farts.
All those things, that's why people like of a common sense background, listen, God gives instinct to animals and he gives common sense to man. But when money gets involved, and that's what the governor's talking about, is money for the state, that common sense gets jaded, extremely jaded. And all they see is what they wanted. He wants to be known for having great financial freedom, I guess, in the state of Louisiana. But you don't sell your security for freedom. You'll have nothing. Who said that? Was that Benjamin Franklin? I think that,
John Adams.
That holds throughout. John Adams? Yeah. But yeah, so that holds throughout time. So
Sorry
that's
for the delay,
really
by the way,
comment.
Brad, on the feed here.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Brad, I have a question for you real quick. How quickly would this whole racket fold up if it weren't for direct tax money and indirectly Q tax subsidies, if we weren't propping it up?
I think almost overnight. That touches upon, the actual economic feasibility of this whole thing. Direct air capture units, which are like big turbines, they get like $180 per metric ton of CO2 injected into the ground. But from what I understand, the cost of operating a direct air capture unit is anywhere from $200 to $600 per metric ton. Where is the benefit here financially to the landowner who wants to sign on to this? I mean, we know how you make money with oil and gas. You sell it immediately and everybody's, it creates jobs. It creates great finances for people because you're bringing a commodity to the surface and selling it immediately. It's better than gold. It's better than silver. Really, it's just the greatest thing. But when you're taking taxpayer funds to inject CO2 into the ground, where is that benefiting the gross domestic product? It's going to fall on its face without 45Q or any other tax credits. It will just fall on its face. In Texas, I want to say it's Petronova that made a big splash. I want to say the mayors were all, enthralled with how much money and, was going to be generated into the community. But after spending $1 billion of the promised $2 billion, they went bankrupt. There were other companies.
Yeah.
I want to say a Summit. There was others that they spent way more than that, and they're already having to pull in their horns because they're spending way more than the tax benefit is provided to them for.
Yeah.
So
everywhere this has been tried, Brad, everywhere this has been tried, it seems like it's failed.
It has failed, and that's not only in this country. Any other country, whether it's Spain, wherever you go, wherever tax incentives, drop out because it becomes too costly to the community. Wind farms, solar farms, they fail. They go belly up. So it's got to be able to hold up without tax incentives if it's going to be a money-making operation.
And Brad, that touches on a point I'd like to make about Europe driving this in some ways through their ESG requirements for companies, whether that's through some of those big banking institutions that require things outside of financial metrics for ranking companies. Do you see or have you had any indication that Trump is using the tariff talks to get that ESG crap out of the incentives for American companies doing business in Europe?
Such a fluid situation there, I think. I don't know about that. I can't really speak to that just yet, but just to the tariff situation. But I can say what I have read is that BlackRock, Larry Fink, his organization has $12 trillion with which to play with. And he had funded a group here in Louisiana called Blue Sky, who had built a $750,000 gymnasium for a local community. And of course, they loved that. And the next step was they were going to institute a curriculum for the kids. And I'm sure likely it was going to be curriculum that would tell the students how bad CO2 was in the atmosphere, and that we needed to capture it and put it in the ground. So it's a propaganda, campaign as much as anything.
It is. I just saw, speaking of Larry Fink, he just wrote a big op-ed. I can't remember. I believe it was in the New York Times, talking about it's time for globalization 2.0. And I think he may be having a big role to play in the World Economic Forum going forward. I guess he probably already has. So I don't have a lot of respect for what he says, but what he does say is probably an indicator of where the globalists are trying to drive the agenda.
Yeah, he took Klaus Schwab's place as he was getting old, and so now you have Larry Fink in his place. He was already on the advisory board or committee to the World Economic Forum, and so yeah, those guys up there really do want to control the world, whether it's destroying the oil and gas industry, which we really haven't talked about much, I think here, but it's going to make it way more difficult for the oil and gas industry to drill exploration projects if you have 20 to 40,000 acre plumes that are they're not well charted. The Journal of Petroleum Technology stated that, is that you really will put this stuff in the ground, but you won't be able to track it very well. And so
Brad,
that's another huge concern.
One of the things that I've noticed, one of the things that I've noticed is, all of this began with this emergency, this climate emergency. We have to engage in this carbon capture sequestration because of the climate, because of the environment. But the more that lie is exposed as a lie, the less it's talked about. And I noticed that most recently in the legislative session, I was down there every day. I was down there for almost every bill. And the people promoting carbon capture sequestration, I don't think that they ever pitched it as being an environmental good, as we need it for the environment, for climate change. It was all about jobs and that sort of thing. So I think even they now understand that it's just utter lunacy to say that we need this racket in order to protect the environment, or because it would have some appreciable effect on the climate.
Yeah, and we have a comment in the chat here saying, by Lion Up, saying, I watched the pathetic CCS committee meeting put on by the task force yesterday. Makes me furious how bought our legislature is. Bought in our legislature is, sorry.
Right. And what I wasn't able to cover, Chris, at the Tupon Lodge because of time, just was a portion of the presentation that shows a quarter to a half of the Earth's vegetated lands has shown significant greening over the last 35 years. And this comes from NASA, a 2016 publication by the NASA Science Editorial Team. They're saying that the Earth has become greener in the last 35 years, largely due, quote unquote, to rising levels of atmospheric CO2. Now, there's a portion of the planet, and that's a naturally occurring thing. When you look at North Africa, that is certainly the Sahara Desert, a main feature on planet Earth of that particular, continent. It was not that way years ago, about 6,500, somewhere maybe to 10,500 years ago. Sudden increase in monsoon rains transformed that region into a savanna-like environment, making it habitable for humans and wildlife. So that whole period of lush vegetation there lasted for thousands of years before the climate shifted again, leading to the more arid conditions you see today. That was all done without the help of mankind, naturally. So, CO2 is more than likely much, much higher back in the days of the dinosaurs, up to, according to Dr. Patrick Moore, 10 times what we see today. And the planet had much more lush vegetation back in that day as well. Likely you had more oxygen as well, because that is the natural cycle of the planet. We breathe it out, the plants love it, they become more green, and in return they give you oxygen. That's the way it works.
So, Brad,
I have a stunning observation here. Maybe God does know what he's doing. What a stunning observation.
For people like Kamala Harris's stepdaughter who's suffering from climate anxiety, based on what you just said, what advice would you give her, or what comfort do you have to offer?
Climate anxiety. You have to really sit down with people and expose them to the truth. I'll tell you, there's another man, a geologist I used to follow, Sir Don Easterbrook. Great guy. He's got dementia now, so he's not really able to contribute at this point. But he said, look, when you study the facts, when you start to know the truth, it's just impossible that CO2 contributed to the atmosphere from mankind's activities would harm the earth. That's a paraphrase from Dr. Don Easterbrook. He's from the University of Western Washington. And I've listened to him a lot. He's a great guy. He's made his own attempt at speaking common sense to his state legislatures. I don't know how much time we have, but I'll just say that it has not been shown that CO2 is a harmful greenhouse gas, or that removing any amount of the current 420 parts per million in the atmosphere will drop the average global temperature. Now listen. The Greenland and Antarctica ice cores illustrated that CO2 follows a natural cyclical warming, and that increases in CO2 in the atmosphere is a result of, not a cause of, Earth's natural warming processes. Key information for anybody who has climate anxiety to understand. Yeah. It's a result of. It's not the cause of. And so.
And what I'm going to do, Danielle, I'm going to get you. I'll try to find the name of a good qualified climate therapist that I'll send you, so that this young lady can go see. Because obviously, I mean, that's an acutely important issue when someone has climate anxiety. I'm glad you brought that up, Danielle, for the benefit of our listeners.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, Brad, if people want to get involved in the work that you're doing, and if they want to stay up to date with these developments in Louisiana or beyond our state's borders, how can they do that?
Well, that's a good question. I don't head up the organization. So far we've had good people like Mike Slocum and Melody, but helping us a whole lot to create these meetings. Mike can, post an email address maybe for them on your site, and they can reach out to me, and I'll be glad to help them with whatever information they need to host maybe their own meeting in their own community. How's that sound?
Okay, that sounds great to me.
Sounds great.
Okay.
Once again, I have to tell you, Brad, thank you so much for making your voice heard on this. You are uniquely qualified to lend your powerful voice to this. And we just have to continue to fight, continue to become more unified, because all of this is predicated on an obnoxious lie. And we have to continue to fight it. So thank you for taking some time to be with us here. And I look forward to seeing you again, hopefully at some future town halls.
Thank you all so much for having me, and God bless your efforts.
God bless you, Brad. Thank you so much. We'll stay in touch.
Okay. Y'all have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
All right, Chris. Well,
that was absolutely amazing. Yeah, that's extraordinary. What a breadth of knowledge he has. I know we have to go for a brief break with our affiliate sponsors here, but when we get back, I want to talk a little bit more about this.
Sounds good.
It is unbelievable.
If you're looking to invest in physical precious metals or convert your 401k to a precious metals-backed IRA, please consider making your investment with our trusted partner, MetalStacks. Their prices regularly beat the big sites, and they have no credit card fees or minimums. Shipping is free for orders over $500. Just visit metalstacks.com/dwalker or get there from our website, freedomstate.us. If you're interested in the IRA conversion, drop me a message at Danielle at freedomstate.us, and I can get you connected with their white glove service.
Danielle, I've got enormous respect for Brad LeBlanc. I'm so glad that he came on the show. And as I told him, I'm so glad that we have someone like him in our corner on this issue, because I just don't see how. I'd love to see him present his information to the governor, as he said, and just see what the response is, because there is some willful blindness on this among our politicians and among industry.
Yeah, Chris, our state is very rich in terms of geologists and scientists who understand this. I think Brad has done a lot of work on his own just to be able to understand, because of his own interest and because maybe the Lord was drawing that interest to him. Hey, we're having the struggles with the tech today. Are you there? We were just closing out talking about how remarkable it is that, God's blessed us with people like Brad who are so positioned and so expert in these issues, specifically carbon capture, and that, we have everything we need to make the right decision. It's just a matter of public pressure being put on the politicians to do the right thing.
We have to continue to put the pressure on them.
No question about it. Continue to tell the truth and be absolutely relentless. We have to be absolutely relentless going forward. There's no doubt. And I believe that we can win this. I believe when the people are united, victory is inevitable. And I deeply believe that.
Yeah, I do too. And just to close out with a couple of other announcements. One is Secretary of State Nancy Landry's Horse and Pony Show started today at 9 a.m. The demonstration with election equipment vendors. Today is Hart Intercivic Verity Vanguard. That's at the old Governor's Mansion from 9 to noon. So if anybody goes, please, by all means, let us know what it was like. We couldn't make it this morning, obviously, but we have a very strong interest in what's going on there. And so let us know, and we will be following those very closely, and we will be trying to attend as many as humanly possible. And just some announcements on the way out. Tomorrow on For the Love of Freedom, my guest is Dave Hayes. A lot of you may know him as Praying Medic. Really excited to talk to him. That's at 10 a.m. Central, same time, same place. And then Thursday, we are going to be having 107 back on. He was supposed to join us last week and was unable to at the last minute. So he will be with us on Thursday to talk about chemtrails and to talk about elections. So all that to say, we are going to have a very exciting week ahead. We're so grateful for you. We really appreciate all that you do. We appreciate that you listen, that you follow us, that you share us. We couldn't do this without you. So please continue to share, like, and retweet the State of Freedom and Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group. And we will be seeing you all very soon back here, same time, same place tomorrow morning. All right. Thank you, everybody.
God bless you.
The secret to losing weight 2 times faster has gone viral. See the transformations hundreds of thousands of men, women, and teens are experiencing around the world with the Slenderiiz drops. These homeopathic hormone-balancing drops are proven to control appetite, support thyroid function, improve energy, boost mood, and increase metabolic rate. To learn more about the drops or other incredible natural wellness and lifestyle products, email me at Danielle@freedomstate.us or visit the Shop Our Partners page at freedomstate.us. Thanks for joining us today on the State of Freedom. Be sure and check out the show notes for this episode. You can always go there and find the calls to action and resources mentioned in the show, and you can find out more information about our advertisers there as well. If you want to learn more about us or support our work, visit freedomstate.us. To get involved with Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, visit lacag.org. We'll see you next time. God bless.